It's so brilliant for me to be outdoors today walking because I've been down with a very serious flu over the past week. And you know, all I know is I've recovered from this flu. I don't know what kind of a flu I had, and I'm happy that I have not infected anybody within the past 2 weeks in the home. And so I'm happy that I'm up and about. But while we've been going through this sickness, while the world has been going through this virus, a number of things have come to my mind. That as a people, we are beginning to evolve. As a people, especially Africans, black people and Zimbabweans in particular, we self-centered people who only look at self-interest are beginning to be forced to evolve into national interest. Now I'm going to explain the two as I go in this discussion. You see, as Africans, we only think about ourselves. We think about our survival, we think about our happiness, and we will do anything to be happy and to survive, and sometimes even to live very comfortably at the expense of other people because we serve self-interest. We want our families to be happy and no one else, and we don't care about anything else. But this disease is forcing us to start being concerned about everybody else, and that is national interest. When other people's survival, other people's well-being begins to impact your life and self-interest, that you have to care about everybody else, that becomes national interest instead of self-interest. In this nation, where we will even bewitch brothers, sisters, cousins, relatives, so that our kids can be better than theirs, so that we can be better than them, so that we can drive better cars, so that we can go to private hospitals while they go to government hospitals. I would rather be a businessman than a nurse because a nurse is a job that I don't want to do. We are beginning to evolve out of that into a situation where we recognize the value of the nurse, we recognize the value of the doctor, we recognize the value of our neighbor because it now affects my survival. I no longer want my neighbor to be poor. I no longer want my neighbor to be hungry. I no longer want my neighbor to be sick or my relative to be sick, because if they get sick, they might get sick and they might give me their sickness, and I don't want that. For the first time, we want our neighbors to be fine. In a nation where we hate our nation so much that we want our government to fail, we want the worst hospital systems, we want the worst schools, we want the worst public systems, because we can afford private healthcare or we can afford to go overseas, we are beginning to wish that we're the best government, we're the best hospitals, we're the best doctors and nurses, because today, when you get this disease, you want to be able to get treated so that you can survive. You're beginning to start understanding national interest. You're beginning to understand the importance of the nurse aide, the helper. You're beginning to understand the importance of those around you for your well-being. This is what was missing in Zimbabwe. And the Makamba family had to learn this the hard way. The Makambas are rich. They're wealthy. They've always been elite. They've never cared about anybody else. They've never cared about anything else except themselves. And James Makamba was one of the biggest looters of Zimbabwe when he was working for Londro. James was working for Londro way in the 1980s when most black parents didn't even have an education. James was already in the elites, serving Tiny Roland and British shareholders to loot Zimbabwe, selling the Zimbabwean government British arms through Londro, selling the Zimbabwean government Motorola radios to the police force, selling the Zimbabwean army Mahindra trucks. He was doing that, making huge commissions, overcharging the government of Zimbabwe so that he could collect his commissions for himself and General Mujuru and the family back in England, together with other high-ranking government officials. The reason why the bribes had to go to England is so that other people would not know that they were getting bribed. This made James very wealthy. Houses in England. His children went to the best universities in the world, Wharton University. People like Zororo Makamba went to the best private schools and to the best universities across the world because their father was wealthy from looting Zimbabwe. Looting Zimbabwe for colonialists. Londro was one of the biggest colonial companies that owned more than 1 million hectares of land. Sanctions are because companies like Londro lost their properties in Zimbabwe. James Makamba worked for those interests. James Makamba didn't care whether Zimbabwe has got sanctions because he had wealth outside Zimbabwe. $65 million home in South Africa, $2.5 million pound home in England. He didn't care about Zimbabwe. He didn't care that he was destroying Zimbabwe. He didn't care that he was externalizing wealth from Zimbabwe because it didn't impact him and his family. They were happy. They were elite. They were better than all other Zimbabweans. They were better than the peasants. And when they needed healthcare or education, they could go anywhere in the world. Then one day, 40 years later, Zororo Makamba contracts a disease coming from America. He gets to the airport. They recognize that his temperature is high. They try to quarantine him. He picks up his phone, connected to the president, connected to high-ranking officials. He phoned. They allowed him to leave. For his comfort, but endangering all other Zimbabweans, he entered the country. He went partying that night. They were smoking hubblies with his friends, passing it over. He was transmitting that disease to other people. But he was fine because Zororo Makamba was comfortable. Zororo Makamba was working on promoting genetically modified foods in Zimbabwe. Even though they could destroy the food security of Zimbabwe, even though genetically modified foods could be genetically engineered biological weapons, he didn't care because he's going to make money. And he's connected to government officials who are going to make that money possible. But as God would have it, Zororo Makamba contracted a genetically modified disease, a biological weapon made by certain pharmaceutical companies and countries that want to benefit from the misery of the world. They didn't know Zororo. They didn't care about Zororo. In their world, Zororo was a peasant. He caught the disease. He died. He died because in this country that his father created, in this country that his father's friends, Vanashingi Mtasa, Strive Masiwa, all the IBDC, elite, black elite business people who benefited from black empowerment in Zimbabwe. This black elite that made money because they're smarter than everybody else. This black elite that looted Zimbabwe, got favor. They didn't build the hospitals for Zororo when he contracts a contagious disease that would need him to have world-class facilities, respirators. Couldn't get those respirators because they didn't build them. Nobody else could build them because they monopolized everything in Zimbabwe. We don't have opportunity, so we're refugees. Other people are living in Zimbabwe in poverty because they don't have the opportunities the Makambas have because they monopolized everything. But when Zororo needed help, the community around him could not build a hospital. The taxes around him are not enough to build a hospital. The system of looting, the system of bribes that he had taught the Mujurus and the politicians when he was at Londro is still at play in Zimbabwe, that we didn't build hospitals during sanctions, and so Zororo could not find a respirator, world-class services, world-class nurses, world-class doctors to treat him. He died. Poetic justice. Poetic justice that makes me make this video in self-interest and national interest, not worried about the Makamba interest, because they've never worried about Zimbabweans. I'm using this as a lesson to Zimbabweans that every Zimbabwean must care about each other Zimbabwean. The rich Zimbabwean must raise the one from the bottom so that that one from the bottom can become productive. And when we become productive, we create an economy that is able to help us to survive. In our self-interest, our nation will help us to survive. When we say, let's create industries, stop importing, Strive Masiwa, stop destroying Zimbabwe for your own benefit, for your own monopolization of money payment systems, for your own monopolization of banking, for your own monopolization of telecoms. Stop destroying African seeds and bringing GMOs and using people like young Makamba, because you are destroying the livelihood of other Zimbabweans who then will not be able to raise Zimbabwe to make it a nation in national interest that will be able to make you live or make your relatives live better tomorrow. The Makambas have learned this the hard way. And I'm glad it happened to a rich family, because I hope that the message I've been preaching, when I speak against Vanamasiwa, when I speak against all these wealthy people that were created by this black empowerment, who have then cannibalized Zimbabwe to go and live lives outside, forgetting that Zimbabwe is home. I hope you've learned your lesson and you begin to understand that we all must play our role. Sanctions are real. COVID is real. The fact that the black business elite and the political elite have destroyed Zimbabwe. And I don't talk about the political elite because you talk about them. I want to tell you about the business people who have a role and responsibility after being given our tax money, after being given spectrum to start cell phone networks, after being given tenders by our government and our taxes. You owe us to develop Zimbabwe so that it can also develop you. The Makambas have learned, and none of them is innocent. Zororo enjoyed the benefits of his father's loot. The wife, an irresponsible woman, sat beside the husband when he was looting, thinking that she won't need Zimbabwe. Now she's learned the lesson. I hope every other wife, Kamushinda, all those business people, I don't know all your names, Chingai Mutasa, I've talked to you, I've talked to your wife. I hope you're learning. This is what I was talking about. You haven't built a country. You idiots have become so rich off the poverty and impoverishment of Zimbabweans because you're not building it. But even when the white man was in Zimbabwe, when the self-centered Rhodesian was in Zimbabwe, he made sure that that country was livable. He made sure that when they had sanctions in Rhodesia, they supported the country. You, Mutasa, Makamba, Masiwa, you have neglected this country and become richer. You thought you were wise. Makamba now knows that he's not wise. Makamba lives in Joburg. He will spend 100,000 in a night on women. 100,000 buying champagne. But he couldn't get a respirator for his son for $120,000. But he lives in a 65 million rand house in Johannesburg. That is the epitome of what you, the Zimbabwean businessman, the epitome of self-centeredness is. And you are now reaping what it is that you've created in your own country.